Hope in the doom and gloom. It feels like a pretty ladened topic. First of all, how can any one person know what brings a whole community hope? And secondly, who is defining doom and gloom? I guess all I can do is share with you all of my conceptions, both of hope and of doom and gloom, which is all I am ever really able to do. And perhaps we can discover places where our ideas overlap or connect, and maybe stretch into new ways of being and discovering together. I once read portions of a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker. He spent over 700 pages trying to describe why he believed violence has drastically declined over the centuries and even the millennia. His list of citations is over 100 pages long, showing that there are numerous people who have written about the horrors of violence in the past, and that there are many people who agree with his hypothesis. Pinker argues that with the Enlightenment and with the spread of democracy, there has been a drastic decrease in violence, arguing that the number of people who are killed in violent conflicts has steadily dropped. Pinker argues that moral progress has led us to this place that he wants to call the long peace. I stated that I only read parts of this massive tome because I really struggled with the concepts that this old white man, highly educated, and Pulitzer Prize finalist had to state. I did not agree with his definition of violence. He explicitly stated that violence was a physical thing. He refused to include any sort of violence that did not include physical abuse. He refused to include, so no verbal abuse, no economic inequality, no discussions of oppression or political structures condemning marginalized populations. And perhaps if Pinker had chosen to broaden his definitions of violence, then he would have to reevaluate his conclusion. And maybe even recognize that the violence in the world today is higher than it has been in decades. For me, violence in this more broadly defined way is the doom and gloom that we are now facing. The violence that humankind have done to the earth. The violence that white supremacy has done to humanity. The violence that heteronormativity, that means the normalization of heterosexual relationships, is normal, that has been done to humanity. The violence that cisgendered normativity, which means the normalization of people whose gender identity matches the sex that they were assigned at birth, has done to our humanity. The violence of the doctrine of discovery, which really is just one of the precursors to white supremacy and all of the trauma that it has created. I feel that I could go on and on describing the many different kinds of violence we have to endure these days. Generational trauma, alcohol, drugs, maybe capitalism. The point is, there are so many things in our world to fight against, to fight for, to be concerned about, and to feel overwhelmed by, that we could get lost in the doom and gloom. I have on several occasions wondered how we are going to solve the challenges in the world. How are we going to come out better on the other end? How to gain control in situations, how to overcome stability or struggles, and how to find stability. There have been times when I don't want to. I would rather focus on the things that I can achieve, finding a sense of accomplishment and tackling the small stuff, just to keep my head afloat. I can't keep track of all of the rallies, marches, protests, and vigils that are happening in this little city, let alone managing to find time to go to all of them. Trans Day of Remembrance, healing circles, homelessness roundtable conversations, voting and discussing political matters, a vigil for overdose drug awareness, mental health education events, and 5-kilometer walk-in runs, climate awareness marches. These are all things that I have done in the last 8 months, maybe a little longer. And yet, sometimes I feel as though it is not enough. Actually, I often feel as though it is not enough. What do we do when we feel that way? When we have recycled everything that we can, when we have divvied up the paper and the plastic, the light bulbs and the glass, the cans and the styrofoam, we have started composting and we have reduced our purchases of plastics. We have bought reusable items and we have stopped using straws and cotton swabs, and we take cloth bags to the grocery stores, and we have done everything that we can think of, but the scientists tell us it is still not enough. What happens when we go to bed at night and whisper to ourselves, little doll, what shall we do?" I think that this is when we need to turn to the parable of the choir, reminding ourselves that we are not alone out there and that we are able to lean on the support of those around us. Take a step back, have a breather, and remember that we do not have to save the world or even our own small corner of it alone. We can look at this from a different point of view, or maybe through a different lens. Some 150 years ago, the world was introduced to the idea of natural selection, or survival of the fittest. Previous to this idea was an evolutionary theory of essentialism, the idea that every species had essential characteristics that would not be alterable, and transformism, the idea of the altering of one species into another, much like the alchemical transmutation of a base metal into gold. Darwin's concept of survival of the fittest offers us a look at how heritable traits change over generations. Without getting into the biology of all of it, I'm sure that we can all agree that natural selection is a very widely accepted concept of evolution. But it feels as though this is not going to help us overcome the current struggles within the world. It doesn't necessarily help us in the struggle to survive when we actually need to thrive. So we'll turn to a different science, that of resilience. As the human population grows, the variety of life declines, the ice caps shrink, and our Earth system behaves in ways its species have never experienced. The past no longer provides us with a guide to how the future will behave. We search for solutions while moving into an increasingly uncertain space. In such a time, resilience science provides important insight to help communities engage with a complex set of challenges that we need to navigate. Resilience scientists define resilience as the capacity of a system to absorb disturbances and reorganize so as to retain essentially the same function, structure, and feedbacks. This is a quote from resilience.org, and it helps us to understand that no longer will it be survival of the fittest, that the persons or individuals, people who are best able to cope with the struggles, who are best able to overcome adversities, who are best able to challenge the status quo that will end up coming out on top. But it is the communities that have the ability to cope with shock and yet keep functioning who are going to overcome. Our collective ability to withstand the violence that is currently being perpetuated on humanity and the earth will be directly connected to our ability to be resilient. The parable of the choir. A choir can sing a beautiful note, impossibly long, because singers can individually drop out to breathe as necessary, and the note goes on and on. Another allegory that could help us here. Are you a carrot, an egg, or a coffee bean? A young woman went to her mother and told her about her life and how things were so hard for her. She did not know how she was going to make it, and she wanted to give up. She was tired of fighting and struggling. It seemed as one problem was solved, a new one arose. Her mother took her to the kitchen. She filled 3 pots with water. In the first, she placed carrots. In the second, she placed eggs. And in the last, she placed coffee beans. She let them sit and boil without saying a word. In about 20 minutes, she turned off the burners. She fished the carrots out and placed them into a bowl. She pulled out the eggs and placed them into a bowl. And she ladled coffee into a cup. Turning to her daughter, she asked, "Tell me what you see." "Carrots, egg, and coffee," the daughter replied. She brought her closer and asked her to feel the carrot. She did and noted that they were soft. She then asked her to take an egg and break it open. After peeling off the shell, she observed the hard-boiled egg. Finally, she asked her to sip the coffee. The daughter smiled as she tasted the rich aroma. Then the daughter asked, "What's your point, Mom?" Her mother explained that each of these objects had faced the same adversity, boiling water, but each had reacted completely differently. The carrot went into the water strong, hard, and unrelenting. However, after being subjected to the boiling water, it softened and became weak. The egg had been fragile. Its thin outer shell had protected its liquid interior. But after being through the boiling water, the insides became hardened. The coffee beans were unique, however. After they were in the boiling water, they managed to change it. "Which are you?" she asked her daughter. "When adversity knocks on your door, how do you respond? Are you a carrot, an egg, or a coffee bean?" Now, I know that the moral of this story is to say, be the coffee bean. When adversity comes knocking, kick it in the butt, make it change, and turn things around. But the reality is that we can't always do that. And I don't think that we should have to do that. Boiled soft carrots and hard-boiled eggs can be just as delicious and necessary as coffee. Taking time to allow ourselves to be delicate, soft, and malleable can be necessary. And it is important to grieve when life becomes overwhelming. And there is a time to get fierce and persistent, to combat the struggles with a hardened heart as well. We need all voices in the choir. Those who can find the shift needed to make it through adversity while changing their surroundings, and those who are affected by their surroundings. A colleague of mine posted an article to Facebook last week. The article was entitled, "Self-care Isn't Enough. We need community care in order to thrive." That described much of what I spoke about last week: community care and community resilience. In the tagline, my friend, Reverend Christina Spouty, stated, "This is the only sermon I will ever preach. We need each other. Until we learn that in the depths of our bones, we will all suffer." There's a belief that ministers only ever preach one sermon with the same underlying tones that always files back to the same concept. Reverend Christina's one sermon, "We need each other. Until we learn this in the depths of our bones, we will suffer," fits for me this month. Resilience is in our community. Hope is looking towards those around us and figuring out how we overcome our struggles together. Finding hope within our community, within our patterns, and our schedules of being together. This is part of the reason why we put time limits on leadership roles within our church, so that we can be resilient. This is part of the reason why we gather for worship every week, because worship means to acknowledge the worth of something. And we need to acknowledge the worth of our lives, our struggles, and our challenges in order to keep moving forward, in order to find hope, in order to find strength and resilience. Just like Vasilisa, if we continue to practice, continue our rituals, and make it through our struggles, we will be better for it.